The real problem is we have a world of people who say they're about medical freedom. They say they've woken to government waste, fraud, and abuse. They say they've woken to corruption. They say Bobby Kennedy is now HHS secretary and Jay Bhattacharya is now at NIH. And so we've all got all this stuff taken care of. But they're failing to understand that this was, since 1998, a
Right.
criminal racketeering consortium between the Gates Foundation, between the Wellcome Trust, between NIAID,
That's
the
right.
National Institutes for Health, CDC, FDA, and all of their conspiring co-conspirators across the World Health Organization's Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which is actually the Clayton Act violation since 2011 of our largest antitrust reform in the last century. Most citizens don't even know this.
Right.
The reason why we have health and human services is for the suspension of liberty.
Mm.
So, giant shock when Bobby Kennedy becomes the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Why is Dave Martin not dancing on a field of daisies, singing kumbaya and going, ha, the Messiah has come? Well, the reason is because Bobby Kennedy is still not telling the American people, just like everybody else, that in fact, HHS was the reason why we had COVID. HHS was the reason why we had mRNA injected in the arms of millions and millions of unsuspecting people.
Right.
HHS was the reason why we had genetic modification of at least two-thirds of our society under an experimental gene therapy that includes an agent known to actually accelerate cancer. Giant shock. Dave Martin's not enthusiastic because if Bobby Kennedy had walked into office on day one and said mRNA is off the shelf forever,
Right.
then I would have gone, okay, he's doing his job. But he didn't do that. As a matter of fact, a few weeks later, he doubled down on mRNA and let the president get out in front of the world and say, we're going to now cure all kinds of diseases with this wonderful collaboration with Palantir and Peter Thiel and Larry Ellison's Oracle, where we're going to somehow make mRNA on demand, where it's almost roll up to the side of the mRNA shot, you get a little sample of whatever you are, and next thing you know, you're injected. And here's the problem. The problem is people who are missing that point are missing this point. I just read you a document that every American should be reading. Every American should be reading that document. Every American should be going, who the hell are these people who think that they can just sit there and with impunity? I mean, listen to this. 280,000 Americans dead, 400,000 on July 4th, 2025. Wouldn't it be a bummer if that turned out to be true?
Well, and this seems to be the modus operandi of these governments to put together a simulation or
Yeah.
a plan for preparedness, and then 6 months later, it actually happens. So you have to ask yourself, what are they planning for this
Well,
summer?
yeah, and tragically, if you go back and look, right? I mean, this goes back, and most people don't know. I was part of the team that helped set up the Risk Assessment Horizon Scanning Program in Singapore. Now, you know as well as I do, Shannon, that some of your viewers and a lot of people who like to troll me on every form of social media go, well, I wonder what his motives are, because he works with all these people. Well, it turns out I work around the world to try to actually break the plans of horrible people doing horrible things.
I love
That's what
that.
I do. And it
I
turns
love that.
out that sometimes that means working with, are you ready for this? Some people who are not so attractive, but that's
Right.
okay because that's what you do. And for those of you, by the way, who are holier than thou and who have never, ever, ever worked with somebody who is slightly off color, I'd encourage you to read the book of Nehemiah because it
Yeah.
turns out in the Bible, in the book of Nehemiah, we have a guy who God put in, that's right, the bodyguard to the worst king on the history of the planet. So
Pretty bad.
there's
That's
that
right.
little detail. So freaking read your book before you criticize. But
Yeah.
let's take a step back. When we set up the Risk Assessment Horizon Scanning Program in Singapore, what we were doing was trying to anticipate risks that could come, which would be highly disruptive. What we were not doing, and what the World Economic Forum did, with the help of Klaus Schwab and with the help of the name nobody ever talks about, the Australia Davos connection,
Mm.
Michael Rue, who I can guarantee you no one has mentioned on any show ever, because nobody actually knows that he's the guy who floated money to Klaus Schwab to keep WEF going when
No
WEF
way.
was about to go away. But let's not let the details get in the way of these things. What we did not do with risk assessment horizon scanning is we did not contemplate and plan actions that ultimately were going to be executed. What we did was we tried to get in the minds of people
Mm,
and say, what would a nefarious actor do?
right.
And famously, I used to give speeches called the Archduke Ferdinand Bullet speech. Now,
Okay.
for people not familiar with the First World War, most people don't realize that the First World War is, in many respects, at least kind of apocryphally credited with the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. Now, World War I was going to happen. Archduke
Mhm.
Ferdinand in moment was just a catalyst. But the fact of the matter is, using that as a motif, what I did was I looked at the world and I used to, on an annual basis, give lectures about where the Archduke Ferdinand assassination was going to happen around the world. And the reason we did that then is because it was important for us to think about how to get the world aware of things that it wasn't aware of.
Right.
When you read the document I just read, Shannon, it's a totally different document. This is a statement of intent.
Yes.
This is a statement of a plan. Well, remember that the whole point of these is essentially to kind of let us know the audacity of the thinking, if you want to call it thinking. I would
Right.
call it conspiring, because it is actually, once again, using a legal definition, it's conspiring to commit acts of terror. And people in positions of authority are now absolutely convinced that they can, with reckless abandon, imagine a world where you kill 200 and what's our total here? Our total on July 4th, 2025, 280,000 Americans dead during July 4th celebrations. I
Unbelievable.
don't know what level of insanity we have sunk to when we think that it's okay for somebody to just kind of play around with, oh, let's just say 250,000 people just get murdered on a day. And remember, this is without attribution. This is from the same people who sat in the UN and in Congress and lied to us about weapons of mass destruction. These are the same people who lied to us about, we don't know where anthrax came from, despite the fact that in May of 2001, the Army had purchased 300 million doses of the drug for anthrax poisoning, which had never, ever, ever, ever occurred anywhere in human history. So why would we need 300 million doses, a dose for every American, for a drug that had never been used in the history of humanity? Why would we need that? And the answer is, we were going to get the PrEP Act come hell or high water. And the
Right.
PrEP Act was going to give manufacturers of pharmaceuticals absolute immunity for anything they declared as a medical countermeasure. You know, Shannon, I point out to a bunch of people, and once again, some of the medical freedom movement make me sick because they genuinely pretend like they've got their finger on the pulse of things. But let's get really clear. We have an emergency use authorization that is continuing on. Are you ready for this? The opioid epidemic. Now, stop and listen to what I just said. It's been running longer than COVID. You haven't heard anybody in the medical freedom movement talk about it. But don't you think we should be concerned that Moderna has a patent on a vaccine for opioid addiction? A vaccine for opioid addiction. Listen to those words. Isn't it troublesome that if you go to Texas right now, you can actually see in multiple clinical trials in Texas, women enlisted in the armed forces being subjected to breast cancer vaccines? Breast
No.
cancer vaccines, because clearly what we need is a vaccination against breast cancer. This is nonsensical. We are killing the women in our armed forces, and we're doing it and all under emergency use authorizations with no liability whatsoever. And we're doing it because under uh, 21 Code of Federation Section 50.20 to 23, the president can waive informed consent for any member of the military. So guess what?
Man.
We are allegedly so with it because we're now welcoming women into the armed forces only to line them up to put them into breast cancer vaccination clinical trials. See, why are you having this response? You're having this response because the medical freedom movement has failed
Mm,
to get the real issue. This has
yeah,
never been about COVID. It has been about biological weapons perpetrated by the United States on the United States for the purpose of suppression of liberty. That's what it is. And we still don't have the right conversation.
right.
So when you hear, are you ready for this? After we have this terror attack, July 4th of 2025, who's going to be responsible for the response? Are you ready? Because this is who you'd expect. Over the next 3 weeks, the joint inquiry will hear from the Secretary of State.
Ugh,
You definitely lead off with Secretary of State when it comes to a health situation. Next, the Secretary of Defense, because clearly we need the Defense Department to cover the fact that they did it again. The Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence. Those are the first four agencies to respond to this hypothetical attack. Now, slow the tape down for a second and just go, okay, what is really going on here? What's really going on is we're finding out where the perpetrators live.